morning. At least the cold weather didn't keep everybody in. If anybody happens to be, especially out there towards Crittenden, we got on the exit there this morning, coming this way. They're hitting them potholes. There's about at least six, I think, 5 or 6 cars sitting on the side, and one guy was changing his tire, but they're busting the tires. It's bad. It's a mess. I found this little track talks about the clock of time. I recently had when I was a little boy, my grandma in the kitchen, I remember up in the corner, she had this big clock. Well, it wasn't too big. It was big to me then. I know it's about that wide and about that tall. And you have to wind it. And I remember her getting up on a stool, climbing up there and winding that clock. And but I've got it now. I forget to wind it. I had it fixed 2 or 3 months ago, and I like to hear it at night. You know, sometimes you wake up and you hear it. It chimes the hour, you know, stuff. But I kind of like it. And but when I was little, I was wondering why. Well, after I got a little older, I was wondering why they didn't have a electric clock. You know, you don't think about it's all lined up. Well, you couldn't plug it in because there wasn't no electric. And I remember when my grandpa and them, it was really something. They had a radio, and the radio, there used to be, I don't know if anybody remembers or not, there's no, what they call a dry cell battery. Remember that? Anyway, it would run that. I really don't know how long it would run that radio, but it would run a long time. But you couldn't turn that radio on until everybody was in there. You know, you had to wait till everybody was there to turn the radio on. Anyway, I got off on that. But they had there was I can remember a Aladdin lamp. They had their old kerosene lamp, but then they come out with a Aladdin lamp. Aladdin lamp had a little mantle like in Coleman lanterns, and it was like 100-watt light bulb. I mean, that was really something if you had an Aladdin lamp. Anyway, forget that stuff. But this track says the clock of life is wound but once. Think about it. And no man has the power to tell just when the hands will stop at late or early hour. To lose one's wealth is sad indeed. To lose one's health is more. To lose one's soul is such a loss that no man can restore. I thought that's pretty good. And Revelations 14:13 says, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord." People are saved. And says a person may go to heaven. He may go to heaven without wealth, without beauty, without learning, without fame, without friends, but no one can go to heaven without Christ. And there's no other name. In Acts 4:12 says there's no other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. And if you don't turn your Bibles in Romans chapter 10, I'll have to read starting verse 9. And when a person dies, if they're saved, they go to heaven. And if they're not, they go straight to hell. And it is very sad if you think about it. And lots of times when a person dies, sometimes you just simply know that Well, mostly, you probably got a good idea if they're saved or lost. And I remember this one guy out there that I sort of hated to be around him because he was just all the time. He was just cussing. He didn't care who was around or nothing else. But I know when he died, they said, "Well, you know, I guess he'll straighten things out." Oh yeah, I guess he will. You know, and it's sad, and there's nothing you can do. You know, after you die. And Romans chapter 10, reading in verse 9, starting there, says, "That if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. For the scripture saith, Whosoever believeth on him shall not be ashamed." You need to think about those verses, and I hope everybody in here is saved, but if there's not, need to think about that. And it's so sad after you die. A lot of people think, well, I'm going to wait, won't put it off, I'm going to wait till the last minute, they think, or something. But you don't know when that last minute is going to come. You don't know when that, your clock is going to stop ticking. And once it does, you're not going to have another chance to, do something else or to accept the Lord. But a lot of people think they're going to wait till the last minute, and then they're going to, be able to accept the Lord or do something, and that's not going to happen. But if you're lost today, you need to think about it. And what's that? That thing on TV. I could have, I should have, but I didn't. And we need to think about that and read those verses again and go meditate on them. Excuse me, something throat. And remember the ones on fire list. Remember Brother L says we'll have that operation. May just each and every one of us pray for him in a special way. And remember others that's on the fire list. And Doris Smiley passed away. And I don't know anything about the arrangements from the marriage. Brother else probably knows them. But remember that family in a special way. And this stand be dismissed in our classes. And Gary, do you want to dismiss us, please?
Good morning to everyone. It's good to be in the Lord's house. If you would, you can turn to Exodus chapter 2. Can't find anything in this Bible. As we begin the study of the life of Moses, and also there's going to be a lot of focus on Moses, hopefully, in this. Because there's so many parallels between Moses and Jesus. But here in Exodus chapter 2, we're going to read just the first 10 verses to get started. And we might get a little further than that, but we'll begin in Exodus 2, verse 1. It says, "And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could not longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. And his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then said his sister, Moses' sister, to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, Take this child away, and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. And the woman took the child, and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, Because I drew him out of the water. We're going to begin studying a lot about, hopefully, like I said before, we have a lot of a focus on Moses in this study. And Moses is one of the greatest men who ever lived. And we're going to see that he was used, not because of how great he was in and of himself, but we're going to see his faith. First of all, his faith in God and how remarkable that was. And obviously it was not just because of him, but because God used him in great ways in the work of his kingdom. And so hopefully we can learn some things from him. We can see the parallels, so many parallels. And every week we're going to be able to point out parallels between Moses and Christ, and there's many even in this lesson here today. But he was used of God in great ways, and God made a great man out of him and used him in a great way. We're also going to see that he is a great type. And the first thing, I just want to go ahead and preface everything by saying this, that he became the greatest of the prophets in the Old Testament. He became a great prophet, and he was also a priest, as we're going to see. We're going to get into that, but this is going to be the overarching focus. We're going to see that he is a prophet and a priest, and through him, as we said last week, or 2 weeks ago, through him God gave us the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, and we'll also see that he was a Levite. We saw there in verse 1 today that he was of the tribe of Levi, and it doesn't even here give us the name of his parents, but it said a man of the house of Levi. So he was a Levite, which would go on to become the priestly tribe. And we're going to see also that he constantly intercedes for Israel. Throughout this book, he is constantly interceding for Israel when they're in the wilderness. And so we see in these things that he is a great type of Christ, that Christ is our great high priest. He is the greatest and the great high priest that we have. And so we're going to see this type throughout the whole entire book of Moses being like Christ. And it's always good to remember, and we've already went over this some in previous lessons, it's always good to remember that there is only one person, there's only been one man who fulfills all 3 offices, prophet, priest, and king, and that is Jesus Christ. We see here that Moses fulfilled 2 of those offices. He was one of the great prophets, and he was a priest, and he interceded for the people of God. And then in the Old Testament, the other great type that we have of Jesus Christ is David, and he was a prophet, and many of his psalms were prophetic, and many of the things that he wrote were prophecies of the Messiah that was coming. So we see that David was a prophet and a king. Moses was a prophet and a priest, but only Jesus is prophet, priest, and king. And as we learned, if you guys recall when we were going through some of that, when we were studying the life of Jesus and who he was and who he claimed to be, that we realized that he is the king of everything. And so obviously Moses is lesser of a prophet than Christ, but when it comes to prophets, there is no one outside of the Lord Jesus Christ who brought more of God's message, who is more used of God than Moses, and we're going to hopefully we'll see that in the lesson. In Deuteronomy 34 and verse 7, we learn that Moses lived 120 years, and his life is divided into 3 different periods of 40 years each. And we won't turn there, but in Acts chapter 7, I believe it was, when Stephen was preaching right before he was martyred, we see that his life was divided into 4 separate sections, 40 years that he lived in Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness, and then 40 years as he led the children of Israel through the wilderness. But I thought it was interesting. I'd never seen this before, but in the study guide, if you've been looking at that at all. It says author George Henderson gives us an excellent outline of Moses' life. And it's first of all that Moses spent 40 years learning to be somebody. And when you think about that, he spent 40 years in Egypt. And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but he spent 40 years in Egypt, and he spent it in royalty. He had the best education. He obviously would have been raised as a prince. He was the daughter of Pharaoh's son, and many people think that she was unable to have children. Doesn't say that specifically in the Bible, but he might have been her only child, and so he was raised as a prince, and so he spent 40 years learning to be somebody. Then in the wilderness, he spent 40 years learning that he was nobody, and that he was on the backside of the wilderness, basically working for his father-in-law, moving sheep around. That really wasn't all that important. And he went from being somebody to being absolutely nobody. And then he spent 40 years learning that God is everything. And so I thought that was an interesting and simple outline for the life of Moses. But I think that's true of all of us. I think to some extent, we all go through those phases. You know, when you're young, sometimes we lack the confidence that we need. And so sometimes we do need to learn to be confident and know who we are and things like that. But then at the same time, there's a point where we have to learn that really we are not that important, and we're only as important as what God uses us for and what we allow God to use us for. We have to be obedient if we want to be used of God. And so we're going to see that in the life of Moses, this obedience and this faithfulness that he had, and hopefully it's something that we can learn from. And I really do want to focus on applying it to our lives, applying it to my life as I go through the study, and hopefully you can too. But the first 80 years of his life are right here in this second chapter. It's very brief. It goes through it very quickly, and we're going to get through at least the first 40 years just today. And then the rest of the book of Exodus is going to be focused on that last 40 years and the important work that he did. But this all led up to it. This is still important to understand where he came from, understand who he was. And so we see here, as we read there in the first 10 verses, that his parents, and I think it's interesting that their names aren't even given here, just so that they were of the tribe of Levi, but his parents aren't named. But we see here the faith of his parents. We're going to look more into that in a minute. I don't want to keep just chasing rabbits, but I thought it was interesting here, even at the beginning of, in Matthew Henry's commentary, he points out that, the tribe of Levi went on to become respected, but at this point, really, when the tribe of Levi was not necessarily that respected. And he points out that when Jacob blessed his sons, if you want to turn there, it's just a few pages over, in Genesis chapter 49, we see that Jacob blessed all of his sons, and some of them he didn't bless. Some of them seem more like almost he made disparaging remarks about them, but he points out here that when Jacob blessed his sons at the end of his life, he really didn't have that much good to say about Levi. And if you read in Genesis 49 and verse 5, this is what he had to say. He said, Simeon and Levi are brethren, instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly. Mine honor be not thou united. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a wall. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob, and scatter them in Israel. So we see here, he curses them. They weren't even given a blessing. And if you read through there, several of the tribes were given great blessings, and others were not, based on the lives of these men. And so he's born into this tribe that's really not that well respected, and has a curse on it, if anything. But we see here that even in this, God can bless. And we see here that God took this, even in this curse, God took this curse and turned it into a blessing, because they were scattered throughout all of Israel eventually, and they were not given any land of their own, but God used them to become the priestly tribe, to do the work of God. And we see here that it begins with Moses. And so he is blessed even in that. So even in his birth, he's typified as Christ. You think about that, the fact that he was born into one of the more lowly tribes, and we see here that there was not much good said about Levi. Christ himself stooped into this world and made himself in the likeness of sinful flesh, and he made himself a curse for us. And just as Moses would have been born under this curse that Levi, one of his ancestors, had done. If you want to look back, you can. I'm not going to get into it today, but if you read through Genesis, you can find out what he did that to deserve that curse and why Jacob said that to him. But we see here he was born under a curse. His ancestors had received this curse in Jacob, And just as Christ, when he came into this world, he stooped into this world. He stooped so low, and he was made in the likeness of sinful flesh, and he became a curse for us. So we see even in this beginnings of this curse, and I thought that was interesting that Matthew Henry brought that out. Starting there in verse 1, we see that this man of the house of Levi took a wife who was also a daughter of Levi. And so this marriage must have occurred before Pharaoh started this edict, but before he began this edict and started killing the male newborns, because it doesn't say so here, but we're going to learn later that Moses had two older siblings, Miriam and Aaron, and both of them will be mentioned in the narrative, and we'll learn more about them. But he had an older sister and an older brother, and so it seems that right about the time he was to be delivered, right about the time he was going to be born, is when this horrible law was first put into place. And so we can't know that for sure, but it would have been sometime between the birth of his older siblings and the time that he was born. And another thing interesting, you see so many parallels, but another one that I just wanted to point out is the similarity between Christ and Moses, that they both narrowly escaped mass genocide. We see here Moses born into this time when everybody associated with him, every male newborn of the Hebrews is being killed, and we see Jesus Christ too. He had to escape. His parents escaped the wrath of Herod and left the country and moved to Egypt, but they were both in Egypt, and they narrowly escaped this mass genocide and this attack by Satan upon them. And we're going to see so many parallels throughout this that are interesting, and you might have already picked up on some of it. Some of them are worth mentioning. Going on in the verse 2, it says, "And the woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw him, that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months." It seems here that Moses' parents knew there was something special about him, and I wasn't going to go there, but you don't have to turn there, but if you would like to read it later, I'm going to turn to Acts real quick, because it seems that in Acts chapter 7 that Stephen too was implying, see if I can find it quickly in this Bible, that there was something special, that people knew there was something special about Moses. Let's see, 7 and verse 17. It says, "But when the time of the promise, drew nigh," this is Acts 7 and verse 17, it says, "When the time of the promise drew nigh, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose, which knew not Joseph. The same dealt subtly with our kindred, and evil entreated our fathers, so that they cast out their young children to the end they might not live. In which time Moses was born, and was exceeding fair, and nourished up in his father's house 3 months." So we see here that even there's this, it's implied that there was something special, and people could recognize that there was something special about Moses. And so there was just more than just a mother's love that drove her to take care of him and protect him from this evil. And I think, and so many of the commentaries that I read tend to think that God had revealed to them, to some extent, that Moses was special and that he was going to be called of God, and that's why they chose to do this by faith. But either way, there was just something about Moses, as it said there, he was a goodly child. And so his mother decided to hide him for 3 months. And in thinking about that and thinking of their faith, this great faith, it's so interesting. Sometimes you might not remember this or realize it, but even in Hebrews, in the great Hall of Fame of faith, they are mentioned. And even once again, they're still not mentioned by name. I think, I'm going to turn there, you don't have to turn there, but Hebrews chapter 11. I think it's interesting that even here they're not mentioned by name. And it might be this is one of the greatest acts of faith, and yet even in Hebrews they're not mentioned at all by name. But see there in Hebrews 11 and 23, if you would like to look at it some other time, it says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment." So we see here that even here there's an implication that says he was a proper child. I think that's just more than just your average, he was a good-looking baby, but I'll leave that up to you to decide. Maybe he was just an exceptionally cute baby. But at any rate, we see this great act of faith, and they're mentioned here in the greatest examples of faith. And they hid it. So anyway, they hid him 3 months. And there in verse 3 it says, "And when she could not longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch and put the child therein. And she laid it in the flags by the river's brink." We see here that she did all she could do. There's so much speculation. Maybe there was maybe every so often they would go through and ransack their houses. Maybe there was a date. And she knew at this point when this child was 3 months old that there was nothing more she could do. She had hid him for 3 months by faith. I'm sure this was a nerve-wracking time, hiding this child. And at some point, whatever the circumstances, there was nothing more they could do. And I'm thinking about this and trying to apply this to us. Are we doing all that we can do? You think about this. They hid this child for 3 months. Now, I know we don't live in this extenuating circumstance. We don't necessarily live in a time where we have to hide people or hide Christians or hide from the world because we'll be killed. But are we doing all that we can do? You think about the effort that they put into this, and it's because of their faith. Faith produces works. Faith produces effort. And so it's a good question to ask ourselves. Are we doing everything that we can do? Are we doing as much as we can do for the Lord? And faith will spur that on. As we have greater faith in God, it will spur us to action. It will spur us to do things that we might not normally do, and especially in circumstances like this. But it's a good question to ask ourselves at this juncture. Are we doing everything we can do by faith? Are we trusting in God enough to do the things that we need to do? And then also, when she could do no more, she left Moses in God's hands. She put him here in the river of all places. And it seems very dangerous to have put a baby in the Nile River. But she left Moses in God's hands, and she could do no more. She left him in God's hands. And that's another thing. Do we sometimes try to hold on to things and do things ourselves that we could leave in God's hands, that we should leave in God's hands? And the Christian life is a balancing act. When I think about that and think about how much we should be doing sometimes, and yet other times how much we should be trusting in God when we're doing things. And it's so hard in the Christian life to get it right. It's so hard by faith. And that's the only way we can do it, is by faith in God. But think about that. Think about that in your own life, because that's something that has to be very personal. It has to be something that you and only you can really know. If you're doing the things you should be doing, and then also doing the things that you should be letting God take care of, and that you should be trusting in Him to do, let God take those things and not worry about them, and not keep trying to make them work when you should let God make things work. God can do everything. When you look at this story and you realize what God can do, by the time we get to the end of this, Moses, one of the people that Pharaoh was trying to kill and ends up becoming the deliverer of an entire huge nation of people, ends up growing up in the house of Pharaoh. I mean, it's astounding. I mean, when you really think about that and how much God can work. So sometimes we just need to leave things in God's hands, and I think sometimes we don't do that when we should. But going on, I will say though, if you aren't doing something for God, then we better get started. And I think sometimes, I don't know why this stuck with me. I was thinking about this this morning, but if you're not doing something for God, then we need to get started, and that starts with prayer. If you are not praying, I think an important prayer for the Christian is that we pray this prayer that God would use you in the work of His kingdom. And if He's not, even if He is, pray that He would use you more. Pray that the Lord would use you in the work of His kingdom. And when we start praying like that, when we start asking the Lord seriously and understanding the costs, understanding what it might take, that when you look at the cost here of being used in God's kingdom for Moses' family and for Moses as we go through this, and look at the cost, his whole life was consumed in doing the work of God. But it starts with prayer, and we need to be doing something. If you're not doing something, then you better get started, because there is no room for Christians that are not working. And I started thinking about how many different Christians and I've been in this boat. I've sat in the pews and been backslidden and not really doing that much for the Lord, and just came to church hoping for a blessing and not hoping to be a blessing. But I was thinking about how many people are sitting in the pews at churches each week, and I was trying to think of a good analogy, and the only thing I could think of is that they are spiritual bums. There are people who come to church every week, and they might as well be holding up a sign that says hungry and homeless. And they want to be fed. They want that spiritual feeding. They want to be blessed. They want to feel like they belong, but they don't. That's it. They hold their sign. They sit in church. They say, "Help me, feed me. I'm homeless. I'm hungry," and then they leave. And what do they do all week? I guess they starve to death until they come back again on the next Sunday. But we are not to be like that. We are not to be spiritual bums. And there's so much more. We all do need spiritual food, but there's so much more that we can do. And if we're not, I don't know. I've been in that place in my life before where I was not doing enough for the Lord. And I don't know that we ever get to a place where we feel like we're 100% doing everything we can. But that is something that we're supposed to strive for. It's something we're supposed to work for. And we see here, look at the work that Moses' mother, especially, she's mentioned here specifically. I'm sure his father was involved too, but we see her specifically. She hid him. I mean, how much work that must have been to hide a baby, a newborn baby for 3 months. And then she went to the trouble of, she created this ark and she made it, I'm sure she built this with great care to take care of Moses. And then she left him in God's hands. But look at the work that she did. Look at all that she did in preparing so that he would be safe and that the Lord could take care of him from then. And so, I don't know, I hope that convicts you like it convicts me that we need to work harder, we need to do better, and make sure that we are not just spiritual bums, that we're not just looking for a blessing, looking for that spiritual food, and that's all we're doing, because there's so much more that we are to do. And if you don't have something to do or you feel like you need more to do, then pray, ask the Lord. Start praying that prayer, and you might find that you have more work to do than you want to do. But use me in the work of your kingdom. You start praying that, and the Lord will give you something to do. He'll find something for you to do that you can work for him. At any rate, going on in the verse 4, we see they left Moses in the river. It says, and his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. And his older sister watching him, and they left him to the care of God Almighty. And even though this might have seemed extreme, it might have seemed scary, there's never any better place to be than in God's care. And that's where Moses was. And we know here what happened, that the daughter of Pharaoh came down and she found him. He was crying. She had compassion on him. And I think it's interesting that it just so happened, I say this a little tongue-in-cheek, but it just so happened that the only person who could have compassion on Moses and the only person who could ignore the king's edict is the one that found Moses. So that's amazing. And so Pharaoh's daughter finds him. She has compassion on him. And there was a lot of speculation if people knew. In the commentary, some people said that Moses' parents would have known this is where the royalty came down to bathe, and they were hoping that, that somebody that was royal would find him. And maybe so. I mean, I don't know if this was just total chance or if they knew that to some extent. But even if his parents did know that this was a place where the royalty and people from Pharaoh's household would come to bathe, the best they could have possibly hoped for was that Moses would be taken. They would not kill him because they found him and thought he was cute, and that he might have been spared, but he would have been at the very best, he would have been a slave in Pharaoh's palace, and he would have survived, but he would have been a slave. And this could have, I think in their mind, if that was my child in my mind, that would have been the best outcome that you could hope for, that whoever found him wouldn't kill him and that he would become a slave. And this was the best that they could hope for. But can you imagine? They never could have imagined what happened next. That not only did he become he was found by Pharaoh's daughter, and she adopted him for whatever reason. Most of the commentators tend to think that she didn't have any children of her own, and that's why she adopted him. Maybe she couldn't have children. But not only was he found, but he was not made a slave. He was adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter. He was adopted and became royalty. Just like that, he went from being hunted, and he would have been most certainly killed at this moment. If anybody else but Pharaoh's daughter had found him, he would have most certainly been killed. He would have been reported, and they would have killed him, or whoever found him would have killed him themselves through the baby in the river. But he was found by Pharaoh's daughter. And when you think about that, the astounding providence of God, and in this story, and then not only that, but then we see here that Pharaoh's daughter, and I don't know if this was what. I don't think Moses' parents could have possibly imagined that it could have gone this good, but we see that his sister comes up and says, do you want me to find you a maid, somebody to take care of this baby and to nurse this baby? And Pharaoh's daughter says, yes, absolutely, find me somebody who can take care of this baby. and I'll pay you. I mean, it doesn't, it's astounding. It's astounding beyond belief, the providence of God. And I'm getting ahead of my notes, but it just, when you think about that, when you think of just the fact that at least for a while, and we don't know how long, but for some time, he might have lived with them till he was old enough to be educated, which I don't know what age that would have been in Egypt, but we know that he was able to live with his parents for some time. And it says there, we'll read it. It says, verse 9, it says, "And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it, and the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she called his name Moses." I don't know if this was just until the child was weaned and did not need to nurse. It seems to me that it must have been longer than that, because as Moses grows older, he seems to know a lot about his heritage and the fact that he is a Jew. And we see here that he begins we're going to see later that he sees the plight of the Jews, and he sees the plight of his brethren. And so I tend to think that maybe he was able to live with them until he was to be educated formally, which might have been 4 or 5 years old. Who knows? We don't know. That's all speculation. But at any rate, he was able to, his mother was able to take care of him. And I don't know, we know this story, but when you really think that, really think about that, wrap your head around that, the providence of God, it's mind-boggling. And so then in verse 10 there it says, we just read that, I'm sure that he had the best education. We see here he was raised by Pharaoh's daughter. He was probably educated in everything in the world. He probably knew more about the world than most people living at that time, not only about Egypt and had the finest educators, but even about the world around him. He would have understood politics and all this stuff. He learned all about these things. And even in this, God is preparing him to lead Israel. You think of this fabulous education that he got, this Ivy League education, if you will. And it's just mind-boggling. We just have just a few more minutes. I should have written this verse down, but I didn't. But in thinking about that, and I already mentioned this, but the fact that Pharaoh tries to crush Israel, he tries to basically just, it's almost had to be an act of Satan when you think that instead of just enslaving them, it seems like you would have wanted to keep the male children because you could have kept them in slavery and have a new workforce going up. But we see here he tries to crush Israel. He works the ones that are alive to death, and he starts killing all the male babies. And when you think about how evil that was, and then yet in the middle of all this, all he manages to do when he starts this is right exactly this time when Moses is born, and not only does he bring on the deliverer and bring on God's will, and we're going to see that God's justice on him, but he raises this deliverer in his own house. He supports him, educates him, and pays for his entire living in his own house. The deliverer of Egypt is raised. And the verse there that was in relation to this, and it's always good to read verses like this, I think, but Proverbs 21, and you don't have to go there, it's just one short verse. If I can get there, I need to get a Bible. I can actually change the pages in. But Proverbs 21 and verse 30, if you want to look at it later. Proverbs 21 verse 30 says, "There is no wisdom nor understanding nor counsel against the Lord." And then it goes on to say, "The horse is prepared against the day of battle, but safety is of the Lord." And so we see here that this amazing providence of God, and we're going to see this throughout Exodus. If you don't learn anything else, learn that God can do anything, and that if you are his child, you are always in his care. You are always in the providence of God. And we're going to see that time and time again throughout the life of Moses and with the children of Israel. And I hope that when I read stuff like this, and a lot of times you don't read over this and really think about it. It seems like more stories that you might have learned when you were in Sunday school when you were younger. But when we read these accounts, when we really meditate on these things and think about what God is doing here, it should increase our faith. It should help us to realize that we can put our faith in God and that we can trust in him. He can do the same thing in our lives. And I know it might not be on the same grand scale, but if you have a problem, if you have something that seems insurmountable, something that you cannot tackle on your own, whatever it is, God can see you through that. God can work and in ways that, and beyond our wildest imagination, in ways that we can't even imagine. God is able to do anything, and he can do more than we can imagine, more than we can ever even think to ask him to do. God is able, and he can turn it around like that. Just 1 minute, Moses was hunted and could have been killed, and 2 seconds later, he's on his way to becoming, some commentators even think that maybe he was somewhat in line to be the next Pharaoh. I don't know about that. I don't know if how that would have worked if a Hebrew could have even been Pharaoh, but some of the commentators said that he might have been, arguably had at least an argument to the throne, being the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Could have been on his way to being the next Pharaoh. And anyway, at any rate, he goes from being hunted and almost killed to living in Pharaoh's house and having all the benefits of that, all the education, living in his court. I'm sure he had responsibility. I'm sure that he was blessed. I'm sure that God blessed him. I'm sure that God blessed him in everything that he did, even when he was in Pharaoh's court for the first 4 years. And it doesn't really go. That's all we really know about these first 40 years is what we see here, and it's very brief. But just imagine that. Think of that, what God can do, and hopefully that will increase our faith and our trust in God. So with that, I'll let you. You're dismissed just a few minutes early. Thanks for your attention.